This debate is entitled, Can We Trust the Evidence? The IPCC, a Case Study. With me on the panel to look at this question, we have on my far right Fred Pearce, a freelance journalist and author of a number of books, including The Climate Files, The Battle for Truth About Global Warming, which is a fascinating investigation into the goings-ons around the Climategate scandal. I can well recommend it. On my left, I have Oliver Morton, the Energy and Environment Editor at the Economist magazine and former Chief News and Features Editor at Nature. He's also the author of the book Eating the Sun, How Plants Power the Planet, amongst some others. And to my immediate right, we have Tony Gilland, the Science Society Director at the Institute of Ideas. Tony has edited a number of books around science and society, including the book What is Science Education For? Tony is also director of the IOI's Debating Matters competition, which some of you may know. So I'd like to get started, and I'll ask Fred if you'd like to start, please.
Can we trust the evidence? I don't know. Evidence is only evidence. I mean, evidence isn't proof of anything. Evidence isn't. It may just be a bunch of statistics or facts. I mean, it's, you know, evidence is only that. So I think part of the problem is over-interpreting evidence and jumping to conclusions from evidence. That may sound a bit picky, but I think it's kind of relevant to where we get to with IPCC. And the facts may be wrong or not as interpreted, which I guess brings us to IPCC, or perhaps mainly to one paragraph, the paragraph in the IPCC report in 2007, which got known as Glaciergate. I think probably the reason I'm here really is because I started all that. So I'm going to, we can talk about other things, but I want to explain how that happened, which I think is a bit illuminating for those of us concerned about the way that IPCC works. About a year ago, slightly less than a year ago, I was called by some glaciologists who told me that there was a howling error in the middle of the 2007 IPCC report, which had been published for 2 years, but nobody had really spotted. And it was the one which said that the Himalayan glaciers would melt away by 2035, which they said was complete nonsense, obviously nonsense. And unfortunately, they said the source for this was something which I'd written in New Scientist magazine 10 years before. They traced it back, the reference given to the claim that the glaciers would be gone by 2035 was in fact a report written by WWF, World Wildlife Fund, in India in 2005, which in turn referenced a short news piece which I'd done in New Scientist back in 10 years before. That appeared to be the only evidence for this. Now, I mean, this appalled me, obviously, because you know, I was party to a bad error. But also, how on earth did this get from being a little journalistic story that I wrote, which is simply an interview with an Indian glaciologist? How on earth did this get into the IPCC report? And it transpired that a lot of cutting and pasting had been going on, and nobody had been really checking the veracity of this claim. Made a little more complicated by the fact that the guy who'd made the original claim in an interview with me, who'd said he said he was about to put it into a report, which in fact it never did turn up in that report, but we didn't know that at the time, was at this stage last year working in an Indian research agency for Rajendra Pachuari, the chairman of the IPCC. So lots of kind of odd ramifications here, but I think the essence of it was that something which turned up in a journalistic article as quoting one individual scientist with something which most people regarded as evidently erroneous had been cut and pasted several times and turned up in an IPCC report and then hadn't been questioned or commented on for almost 2 years. Once the questions did start arising, Rajendra Pachuari, the IPCC chairman, continued to defend the statement. He didn't kind of say what you and I might have done, oops, sorry, bit of a mistake there, we better correct that quickly. He defended it. He accused people who criticised this statement about Himalayan glaciers being engaged in voodoo science. And it took a long time to persuade him that maybe he ought to rethink this view. And it took quite a lot of work from quite a lot of glaciologists and quite a lot of journalists, I have to say, to do that. And all this happened at just after the Climategate, the emails row had surfaced, which had raised some important questions about process at the IPCC, about scientists writing chapters of IPCC reports in which they had a clear conflict of interest because they were essentially reviewing not only their own research, but people who were writing research criticizing their own research. So they were gatekeepers on their own account. And that had raised some worrying issues. So, I mean, as you might imagine, journalists went to town on this, and they found a number of other much smaller but difficult to explain things in IPCC reports, or particularly in the second of the three assessments that had come out in 2007, the one looking at the impacts of climate change, or potential impacts of climate change. So after Glaciergate, we had Amazongate. Never struck me that there was much in that. There was a fuss about exactly how much of the Amazon rainforest might disappear. And there are a few questions about referencing for that. But essentially, there wasn't much of a row there. But there was a row over a headline claim which was in the summary for policymakers of the IPCC report, which Pachuari himself had referred to in a number of presentations on the report, including at the launch of the report, which claimed that in some African countries as much as 50% of agricultural productivity could be lost, not in the dim, distant future, but by 2020. Again, a very startling claim that you might have thought somebody might have checked rather carefully. The only source for this was a report written by a Moroccan scientist, an 11-page report concerning only 3 countries out of the 53 countries in Africa, Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, on the sort of very, very arid Saharan north of the country, not perhaps typical of Africa. And if you read that 11-page report, it makes no specific claim about climate change at all, in fact. It's not a peer-reviewed report. Talked in general terms about other studies, but didn't reference any of them, so we don't know what these other studies were, and still don't. And when you read the detail, actually only said that crops yields go up and down by about 50%, depending on whether it's a wet or a dry year. In other words, it had nothing to do with climate change as we understand it. It had to do with short-term variability in climate, but variability in climate as we know it now. Yet this got into an IPCC report, yet this got into the summary for policymakers of the IPCC report, yet this was specifically highlighted by the chairman of the IPCC in his presentations. Very briefly, as mentioned, the Inter-Academy Council, when it came to review IPCC work, concluded that there was a tendency, particularly in that impacts report, to, quote, emphasize the negative impacts of climate change, many of which were, quote, not supported, I found this amazing, not supported in the literature, not put into perspective, and not expressed clearly. And this is the result, this is the conclusion of the UN, or rather the Royal Society, National Academy of Sciences, and various other agencies' official review of what had been going on at IPCC. This is all about what you do with evidence. Can we trust evidence? It depends how it's used. I'm a defender of IPCC. I don't want to see it abolished. I would like to see Pachuari removed, probably, or he ought to resign, really, I think. IPCC has a really useful function, but I think in many respects it does have to get its act together if we are to, in future, trust the evidence that it presents to us.
Oliver, if you'd like to make your comments.
Yeah, sure, and I'm going to address the IPCC as Fred did fairly specifically, rather than the broader epistemological point about evidence that we can doubtless get onto in the discussion. And I ought to also reveal a conflict of interest in that my brother, John Morton, is a coordinating lead author on the next IPCC review, and I trust him. Love him in a fairly brotherly way, so you can add that amount of salt to what I say. The question is, can we trust the evidence? And of course asks, who's we? So I'm going to start off by giving a sense of my perspective as a practicing writer on these subjects, and I suppose my approach to the IPCC, which I've been reporting on as well as through quite a lot this year, is trust but verify. The IPCC is fairly well referenced. You can find out where the references for things that it says come from. If you can't, then you have a problem. But in terms of providing a first look when you're looking at any particular area of climate science, less so for policy, it's a pretty good place to start, and I do that in my work practice. It does have structural flaws. It is by its nature somewhat out of date. This also leads to a structural flaw in the debate about it, which is that there is a constant debate of things having got worse. There's a constant cry that things have got worse since the last IPCC report. This is normally, I find, not really the case. And out-of-dateness, to some extent, is only an issue because we have the strange dynamic within climate debate that the science is in some ways the locomotive, and new science is a more powerful locomotive than old science. If you demur from this view of how the debate should be running, then out-of-dateness matters a bit less, but it's out of date. I think a bigger risk is a certain embodiment and investment in what you might call epistemic equivalence. That there are three working groups to the IPCC. There's the natural science working group, there's the impact, the adaptation and vulnerability working group. So natural science is called physical basis, and there's the last group who do mitigation and policy. And it's sort of treated as though these things are all equally intellectually rigorous, and any sort of like real grappling with the IPCC report suggests that they are in fact not. And this is partly because the sense there is a physical science and a biogeophysical science of climate change, which is embedded very thoroughly within a physical, biogeophysical science of climate. And so if you want to if you're studying glaciers and climate change, there's a lot of literature just on glaciers that is relevant and can be incorporated and can be used as a resource. That's much less the case in the literature on impacts and the literature on policy and mitigation, because there's not, by and large, anything like there's no equivalent of that general glacier body of knowledge when you come to the impacts of specific changes. So you tend to find a greater level of self-citation and a greater level of investment by all the parties involved in those later working groups 2 and 3 than in the first one. There's also an issue which is slightly related to that, but the IPCC was created with the idea of providing a resource to and for developing countries that they would not otherwise be able to mobilize. So the developing countries' representation is an important issue in the IPCC, and that means that in some areas you do get trade-offs, and we don't know what exactly those trade-offs are because author selection is not a transparent process. But there are trade-offs between expertise and geographical representation in the process. So I mentioned briefly Working Group 3. I think that's the part of the IPCC I have the biggest problem with because it is very captured by the policy process. Working Group 3 is basically, rather than looking at all the policy responses you might have to global warming or climate change more generally, Working Group 3 tends to be how do you actually get the UNFCCC process to work. That's the Framework Convention on Climate Change process to work. And so it tends to come at things from a very specific angle, and I think that does. I think we would be better served by an IPCC that had a much broader policy view. A couple of other things. It's very poor on uncertainty. It doesn't express the uncertainties involved within the process well enough. It also doesn't, and this would be really helpful, provide a list of the things you could do to narrow the uncertainty. I can come back to that later. Another thing is, I think that broadly speaking, I have my professional involvement has been mostly with the most recent review, Assessment Review 4. But I think looking back over history, you can see that the IPCC has become better over its subsequent iterations. There are policy-driven howlers in the early group. Well, there are just things in early reports which have now been shown to be rather deleterious to the future progress. We could talk about the medieval warm period. We could talk about malaria, and gosh, that seems to me that seems to have taken up rather more time than I thought. I want to say at the beginning about we. Who is we? If you're a government, we is complicated in the IPCC since the I stands for intergovernmental, and part of the point of the IPCC is to generate governmental buy-in to the statements it's making. But I suspect we probably means you, the audience, in some ways here, and to some extent you can take my approach, which is to make up your own mind on a case-by-case basis. I would say, by and large, if you look at the references, you can trust the facts as as Fred pointed out, you may be able to trust the frame slightly less. There may be an inherent bias towards conclusions about the damage caused by climate change being bigged up. You can, I think, but we'll probably come into this in the questions as well, trust the meta-narrative above the IPCC, which is that we should expect there to be significant climate change, and we have great uncertainties about what that will mean. And one last thought about does it matter? I must say that in my experience, trust in the IPCC, except among people who are professionally rather too close to it, like Fred and me, is almost always a lagging indicator, not a forward indicator of their beliefs on climate change. People who want to disbelieve other forms of evidence on climate change will question the IPCC. People who don't will tend to uphold it. I don't think reforming the IPCC, though I would like to see it done, is going to vastly change the terms of the debate in any way.
So now go over to Tony Gilland, if you'd like to make some remarks.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm looking at this slightly more broadly and sort of drawing back from the specifics of the IPCC immediately, although I think some very important points have been made. I would like to sort of look at this in relation to the role that the IPCC is expected to play by society and by politicians, and the role that I think it's taken on for itself, particularly in relation to certain individuals like Pachuari. So if you go back to 2007, when its latest report was produced, the theme, not necessarily of the Working Group 1 report, but the theme that was played out across the media was that the time for debate is over. That was the consistent message that consistently came out. Now, at the press launch of the Working Group 1 report back in 2007, the lead author of that report, or one of the lead authors, Susan Solomon, said, she was asked to say, look, can you give us some interpretation here? What's the urgency of action required? She said, it's not my role to try to communicate what should be done. Science can best serve society by refraining from going beyond its expertise. In other words, this is not the job of science to tell us what to do. However, Achim Steiner, director of the United Nations Environment Programme, at the same press conference, was very happy to comment and to tell everyone that the report sent a chill down his spine. And to go on to say that he hopes that this will be the day remembered as when the question marks are removed and we can get on with doing something about it. And throughout 2007, people at the IPCC, the media, many in the media, and lots of politicians used it to argue the debate is over, we've got to get on and take drastic action to cut carbon emissions. And David Miliband made exactly that point when he responded to this, saying that the debate is well and truly over, the window of opportunity to avoid dangerous climate change is closing more quickly than previously thought. Now, my problem with all this is it's using the science to shut down a debate about how we respond to the knowledge that we have. So that debate can involve a discussion about the knowledge that we have, and I think Oliver made a very important point about the uncertainties of the science, different aspects of the science, not being dealt with very well by the IPCC reports. But there's also a vital debate about how we respond to it as a society. Now, that's not a question simply of evidence. You want to know what is known and with the caveats. But then there's a debate that society needs to have about how we respond to this. The narrative and the prevailing response, I think, is really striking. If you look at, there was a report that I wrote about recently, not a report, an article by Martin Rees, the outgoing director of the Royal Society, and Anthony Gilland in the Times. Now, in response to Climategate and Glaciergate and all the rest of it, many in the scientific community are on the back foot. How can we get ourselves into a more trustworthy position? And they said, look, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. The core science is still sound, but look at Pakistan and the floods. Look at Russia and the heat waves. There's going to be more of this, so we need to act now. In other words, they continue on exactly the same trajectory, which is to say, here's the science, it's scary, do this. And I think that's the problem. I think what I would actually say, I would question how much attention we should pay to the next IPCC report. Not because I don't think there'll be interesting science within there, but actually, in 5 years' time, how much more do we need to know to have an adult, grown-up debate about how we relate to this issue? It's the constant focus on the science and what the latest science tells us, And if you look at the role of climate skeptics, and Fred's book is brilliant, by the way. It's almost a raunchy read. The febrile atmosphere surrounding the science and the exchanges between the scientists is absolutely amazing. It comes out superbly from Fred's book. And that whole climate is incredibly counterproductive, both to the science itself, but more importantly to how we as a society look at the question. I just want to give you two further examples. One is from Hans von Storck, who Fred quotes in the book. He spoke at the Battle of Ideas a couple of years ago. He's a German climatologist, and he makes the point, science is deteriorating into a repair shop for conventional, politically opportune scientific claims. Not only does it become impotent, it loses its ability to objectively inform the public. Now, that's one scientist, so I'm not saying that all other scientists share that concern about the corruption of science and that it leads to a lack of questioning. But he's not the only one who says that, and I think that's a genuine concern. But I think there's a bigger concern, and take the role of the Royal Society, who's been a little bit more meek and mild, and it's been put under pressure by its own fellows to release a new report that's a little bit more ambivalent, whatever. But it hasn't really changed its trajectory that much. Go back to 2006, the Royal Society wrote an open letter to ExxonMobil demanding they cut off their funding to groups that have misrepresented the science. Now, I'm not sure who gets to decide who's misrepresented the science and therefore decide that someone must cut off their funding. In a report in The Guardian, Bob Ward, who'd been the author of the letter, gave perhaps away rather more than he intended. And he said, in explaining the letter, the next IPCC report should give people the final push that they need to take action, and we can't have people trying to undermine it. That's not an isolated example. I think that is prevalent within many involved at a high level in this issue, that if we give them the science, then hopefully they'll stop being stupid and they'll get on and do something about it. We're not trusted, politicians aren't trusted, people aren't trusted, to have an open public debate about how we relate to these things. And I think you also have to finally pay attention to the culture in which this has grown up. The measurement of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere first occurred in the 50s, became more clear in the 60s, work got going in the 70s. Around this stuff. So it's only in the relatively recent period that the knowledge has been sort of built up around this issue. That's exactly the period where we have been filled with doom and gloom about every possible impact of humans on society. From the population crisis to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and DDT, it's non-stop. We've had one worst-case scenario after another. So in terms of thinking about our response to climate change, I think we have to question whether that mood of pessimism about human impact on the world is actually that helpful, or whether, and I take more the Matt Ridley rational optimist approach, if you look at the record of what's been achieved, human beings have been very creative and very innovative. And if you look at Pakistan or look at India, India is making really interesting strides, becoming far more positive in terms of its ability to cope with problems. Look at Pakistan and the lack of infrastructure. Look at the impact of earthquakes where there's no good buildings. Why not perhaps repose the question about development rather than accepting the natural limits that are being put forward through this debate? And let's have a political debate about how we want to relate to it, and just forget the science for a bit. There's enough science there for us to work with. Let's just drop the science for a bit and forget about the IPCC.
I'd like to go straight out to the audience, so if see some hands, please.
There are two ideas of yours I found very interesting, Oliver, and I'd like you to talk about how they relate to each other. The one being the idea that science is the locomotive, and the more recent science is the more powerful locomotive. I think that's the image you used. And then later in your remarks, you talked about the meta-narrative above the IPCC and how that can be trusted. I'm interested in how those two things relate to each other. Bjorn Lomborg, who's written a few books over the years, they've all been kicked around. He has his flaws, but there was one very simple analogy he came up with in his original book that I always found quite compelling, which was the idea that orthodox views on climate change, they argue that we need to formulate our policies as though we're in the position of a man with a gun to his head. And with the best will in the world, nobody does the best thinking when they've got a gun to their head. So how can we get away from the idea that the more recent science is the more powerful locomotive to do what needs to be done? How does that relate to the urgency, to the meta-narrative that implies that we are in the position of a man with a gun to his head?
That's, I think, the trouble with science is people look at things black and white, very, very binary. And I suppose the media, television, is a problem in that people just don't seem to be able to cope with uncertainty. What actually makes me worried about climate sceptics, or some of the ones I saw about the report, is not the fact they say it may be wrong, because quite frankly, I expect the IPCC may well be wrong. It's the way they seem to be so certain that it's wrong. And what worries me is the degree of certainty, and certainty, in fact, on both sides.
I'm interested in one of the structural factors that Oliver identified in the IPCC, the 3 working groups. Because I think that tells you quite a lot, not just about the IPCC, but more broadly about the relationship between science and society and the way these things are structured. At the moment, the sense is that, the physical science is the real basis of this, and that Working Group 2, which is looking at the impacts, has to really kind of follow on from that, and then we can kind of discuss the policies and the response. And as Fred pointed out, most of the kind of more serious areas have kind of come out in the kind of Working Group 2, talking about the kind of impacts on society. My worry is that some of the response to this has been, we have to get these Working Group 2 guys to really take the physical basis much more seriously. Perhaps we kind of delay a bit more so they can really kind of take this into account and do things rigorously. I would suggest that the problem is actually, in some senses, the reverse of that. To understand the future, yes, we have to understand the physical changes in the atmosphere and the climate, but we actually have to take seriously the social development, factors like what is going to happen to agriculture in Africa, in its own right as a foundation for understanding the 21st century. So, really what we need is to, much more seriously take a look at a social understanding of the world and development, combine that with our understanding of physical science to kind of understand what's going on. As for all the policy, I think that's kind of done better elsewhere, but I would suggest, get rid of the kind of physical science leads on to adaptation. Let's look at the kind of physical changes and the kind of social possibilities jointly together in order to understand the world.
I have a blog called Uncertain Climate. I believe that it's the uncertainty in the climate which should drive the agenda on how we respond to that. And although people are now starting to think about even quantifying the uncertainty, there's a meeting later next month on this, which I believe Oliver is involved in, talking about trying to improve our uncertainty and trying to how our agenda should be affected by this. But I believe we really don't know, and we probably will never know, whether temperature is going to rise by a benign level, 1 or 2 degrees, which we can probably live with, maybe up to much higher levels, 7, maybe even 10 degrees. We simply do not know. And I believe the policy for this should be one whereby I believe we have to create renewable energy on a worldwide scale as quickly as possible. I believe that's a very important thing to do. And also I think we have to consider about geoengineering solutions in case the temperatures go high. I don't think there's much else to do in terms of the policy on climate change. Should I think be those 2 things precisely.
I have a problem. Why actually do we need an IPCC? I mean, the climate's always been changing. We know jolly well in 1865, the year of the big stink, the temperatures in London were over 90 degrees for 8 days continuously. We know 100 years before that, the Thames was freezing over. The climate has always changed, in spite of the hockey stick graph, which did away with the medieval minimum and other changes. It was set up specifically to show that carbon dioxide is a dangerous gas. And it was shown because, as Tony has said, in 1956, for the first time, we were able to measure carbon dioxide in parts per million. And we did that because carbon dioxide absorbs infrared, but it does so over a very narrow waveband. It's a very weak absorber of energy. It absorbs it between 4.2 and 4.5 mu. I worked on the original CO2 analyzer, so I know this. If you're going to the causes of climate change 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago, one finds the most important causes of climate change is the water in the atmosphere. Water is a very good and very important global warming gas. And the IPCC is ignoring it and concentrating on the one issue, carbon dioxide, because this is a social phenomena and a political phenomena. It is not interested in the science. It doesn't reflect the true science. It reflects a political opinion.
This question about the locomotive, and the question that Tony raised about the fact that this has become an issue at the same time as global environmental pessimism has become an issue. You know, the causal story there could be quite complex. The point is that it is certainly true that people trying to prioritise climate change as part of a political agenda did so by appealing to the epistemic power of physical sciences, and so that's why one of the crucial documents is called an inconvenient truth, suggesting that truth has a moral suasion that doesn't depend on anything else. The fact that argument, that basis was taken rather than, I quite agree, the rather more interesting basis of saying that the carbon dioxide balance in the atmosphere, which is amplified, as we just heard, through water feedbacks, but which is certainly, in my understanding, governing over those water feedbacks, since the residence time of water in the atmosphere is low and the residence time of carbon dioxide is long. The uncertainty that we have about this change in the forcing of the atmosphere means that we have an uncertainty about climate, and it should be within that scope that we should be looking at a range of different policy options. The problem is that at the moment, the fact that the as it were, the first movers on this moved in this basis of saying scientific truth, therefore specific policy outcome. They framed the possibility for a very long debate saying, thus, since policy outcome unacceptable, scientific truth wrong, which we have seen played out in various different ways over the last 10 years. Rather than much more interesting debate as if you agreed that the physical science is not the beginning of the story, but the frame of the uncertainties within which the story unfolds, then you actually have to have questions about, well, if you don't think radical emissions reduction is a good policy, what do you think is a good policy? Can't have that debate at the moment if, to take an example, all the Republican candidates in the midterms say that there's not an issue there in the first place.
Thanks. Tony, any issues you want to look at there?
Just in response to that, I think you can have a debate about different policy options, but I think you also need to have the debate about how society sees itself, because policy options are framed by how society sees itself. So when I raised the example of India, I did so very importantly. We had, for example, a leading surgeon here yesterday talking about alternative medicine. Now, the point that he was making is, this is all very well talking about alternative medicine, but I know with some basic sanitation, with some basic modern drugs, with these sorts of measures, we can prevent illness, we can save millions of lives, we can do this, that and the other. Look at what's happened in Pakistan, look at some of the impacts of tsunamis, whatever. We know that natural things, whether there will be more of them or not more of them in the future because of climate change, can really devastate societies and human life. We also know that the more developed society is, the more that modern technologies are available and what have you, far better outcomes occur even in the face of adversity. So the question of whether we think we can take things in our stride more, and the question of whether we think actually we should be focusing on issues about development and how we encourage greater development like that is taking place in India, to me seems a fundamentally important one in terms of framing how we respond to this issue of climate change. Okay. So I'm sort of arguing for a step back from the policy discussion as well as the science and think about how we're framing this whole question. That's not an evasion. I'm not arguing for that because I don't want to talk about climate science. I'm not arguing for that because actually I do think quite a lot is known about the climate. A lot more is known than was 30 years ago. I'm not arguing from the point of view of scepticism. What I'm arguing is that we are fundamentally misunderstanding this debate because we've jumped to a panicky thing, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? Rather than actually having a bigger debate that will frame things in a more positive way.
I thought that's what I was saying, but maybe
okay.
I wasn't saying it clear enough. But I mean, I think also at the moment, from my reading of the tea leaves, history is slightly on your side. There's a strong... I mean, we are moving towards the 20th anniversary of the Rio meeting, which was, of course, crucial to this debate. We are hearing more and more discussion about how it was unfortunate that the Rio meeting, which could have been much more about development, ended up being very strongly about the environment. And I think there is an appetite in many circles for a greater development thrust in all these discussions. The problem then is that we run into the William Easterly problem, that we don't actually know very much about how to make development work better.
Well, except you do actually run into another problem, which is that the interesting development at that level is that the development for poor countries, which is right, obviously that's a good thing to be focusing on. But what goes along with that is the idea that we've already got too much. America's got too much. So you've actually got, there's a cultural backdrop that's very, very strong.
I don't think that's a necessary part of that debate.
It's,
I mean, I
well,
agree that
that's
you
how
may find that among
but that's
people
actually
you talk
how
to.
it plays out. It's the idea that we've got too much. So just very, very quickly, I think you have to recognise that there's a moral dimension to how the science is understood. So you go back to the late 90s and the debates about GM crops. Nobody wanted to listen to scientists in the wake of BSC. The controversy about GM crops is scientists were completely on the back foot, right? And people like the Royal Societies started to work out, well, how are we going to relate to this? The way they tried to relate to it was to do a PR exercise in relation to the bad publicity. And what has come about is a situation because of the moral message. The moral message about GM crops is you're interfering, you're too arrogant, you think you can play God. There's a negative narrative about GM crops. No one wants to listen to the science. The moral message about climate change is that humans have gone too far, they don't know what they're doing, they can't be trusted, and look at the mess we've made. Let's all listen to the science. So I think you actually have to take account of how the moral narratives in our society today affect the extent to which we are willing to take scientific evidence seriously.
And Fred?
I think we can talk about the sort of policy context and the sort of moral frameworks and so on, but at the end of the day we have to deal with a climate which is changing, which may change very nastily. In other words, we have to deal with the laws of nature, if you like, the laws of physics, rather than just the laws of political discourse. Let me say something about uncertainty. I think we've got to live with scientific uncertainty in climate change. It's not going to diminish anytime soon. There was a very interesting paper at the beginning of this year by Kevin Trenberth, who's a stalwart of the IPCC and by no stretch of the imagination anybody's idea of a skeptic, pointing out that the next IPCC assessment is more likely to widen the error bars on likely warming effect of a doubling of CO2 or any other measure than to narrow it. Basically, he's saying the more we know, the less we know. We're discovering new sources of uncertainty, new areas that we haven't explored properly, new potential feedbacks involving clouds and aerosol and water vapour, certainly, new things that might happen to the carbon cycle. There is no way that we are going to make policy decisions that I think we do have to make in a situation of scientific certainty or even a situation of reducing uncertainty. We're stuck with that. And I think we've got to be grown up, and I think that means the public and scientists have got to be grown up. There's a kind of pact here that the public would like certainty, and so they'd like to be told this is the future, we know we've worked it out, this is what the models say. And scientists pander to that very often. They will say, oh well, if you want us to model exactly what the climate is going to be in southeast England in the 2040s, we can do it for you. Rubbish. Nobody can do that. But scientists are kind of pushed towards doing that. To making predictions. Actually, there are huge areas of uncertainty in this, and they're going to carry on. I think the public has to wake up, politicians have to wake up to the fact that we're going to have to make decisions on that basis. And the scientists, I believe, have to stop pandering to people's desire for certainty. The other point, you made a point about the climate's always been changing. Yes, it should be no part of anybody's argument about man-made climate change that it used not to change. Of course it's changed. There's solar cycles, there's volcanic cycles, there's internal cycles, heat moving from the oceans to the atmosphere backwards and forwards, all sorts of stuff that's going on. To me, however, that makes me more worried than less worried, because if you look at the climate science, what we're doing is pulling at the levers which the history of temperature on the planet shows those levers having big effects. We know that if you move carbon dioxide between different reservoirs on the atmosphere, it creates ice ages, and it takes you out of ice ages. It has huge effects, huge feedbacks involved, which nature does, and we're pulling at nature's levers. So for me, that doesn't give any sense of security. Rather, it makes me much more worried about potential tipping points, potential feedbacks. In that context of uncertainty, I'm far more worried. Skeptics will tend to say, well, we're very uncertain, so maybe we don't need to worry. Well, maybe we don't. But I'm more worried about those sort of top end of the error bars, and the really scary stuff that could be coming down the track. As it's a bit of a cliche, but people do say if you were about to get onto an aircraft and somebody told you there's a 1 in 20 chance of it crashing, you'd get right off. But in a sense, that's what we're doing with some of these concerns about tipping points and so on in climate change. It is scary. We are pulling at really dangerous levers, and we have to be grown up about that.
The way you just explained yourself there, it takes us into the realms of, the way we have to respond to this in terms of policy decisions is take the worst scenario and act on that. And that, to me, is kind of the problem with this. If you're introducing certainty to give us certainty that we must do something now, which is kind of the opposite to the way I would understand it. I mean, in the sense that we can predict the outcome of climate change to any degree of accuracy, then the real answer is we'll only know when it's happened, okay? But what politics does, because it's framed this question as the question that everything must rotate around, is demand an answer. So you're using uncertainty to give them the answer they want, that they must do something. Is that not dangerous if it doesn't turn out to be the case? Because then what have we done? We've sold everybody down one route because politics demanded that, because politicians have a desire for credibility, for legitimacy, for certainty in their actions. And in that sense, are we not talking about the good lie? Are scientists not being drawn into delivering for politicians the good lie? And is that not a really dangerous thing for science, never mind anything else?
Just from what I've heard today, it would suggest to me that the IPCC is a discredited organisation. So the answer to the question is, can we trust the evidence? Not if it's from the IPCC itself, I would suggest. But my questions, I've got 3 questions. One is, why do scientists pander? Which Fred just mentioned. The second question is, should the IPCC be forced to be reclassified as a political body, which is evidentially what it actually is, and that would solve some of the problems in terms of the way people are supposed to behave towards or react to IPCC comments. And my third question, related to the pandering really, is why do scientists involved in climate research allow themselves to be associated with the IPCC in this way? It seems that there is something driving them to do things which historically they would never have done, and basically be quite immoral in their behaviour.
I wouldn't like the importance of Fred's original story to go underappreciated. I work in bibliometrics. In some of our disciplines, over half of the citations in our journals are wrong. This inaccuracy rate has been increasing. It's greatest in our top journals. Often we're just talking about minor inaccuracies, but it's an indication that the people who've cited have not actually read the original source, which is the point of your story. The incentive to write has become very, very much greater than the incentive to read. And there's a trade-off there. And given that the incentive to write is so great, people write knowing that people are unlikely to be reading their work. That has huge implications. Can we trust the evidence? No, because the people producing the evidence are producing stuff as a matter of record, not for people to read.
All 3 of you seem to have the feeling that regardless of uncertainty in the IPCC evidence, we still need to do something about the possibility of the climate impacting on society. Now, in order for anything to get done, it means you need the public to actually act. Now, I'm a member of that public, and my relationship with climate change has been changing very fast. I've been a supporter, I've met some skeptics, I've been a skeptic, and then I thought, it's not as clear-cut as either of these camps make it say. And I want to ask you all, what strategy would you recommend that people take in order to find out the closest possible answer to the truth that they can? Because I don't know, should we read everything that we get? Should we read scientific journals, which I have? I actually took a look at the live satellite data and I plotted my own graphs. I really wanted to see what's going on. What should I do to actually get the best evidence?
I'm not sure how to answer that point. I mean, I think it depends exactly what question you want answered, but maybe read good journalism. There's a couple of us here that will help you along the way. Yes, the IPCC is, of course, it's political. It's set up in a political context. It's an intergovernmental body. It reports to politicians. There's an advantage in that the politicians have to sign out on what they say. The IPCC findings are broadly adopted by, at least formally, by governments. So yes, it operates in a political context, but we all operate in political contexts. I think it's a bit silly for anybody to suggest that we can't, or indeed that we shouldn't. Why do scientists associate themselves with the IPCC? Why do they spend very large amounts of their time working on reports for the IPCC and consulting with them and reviewing IPCC reports? We've heard a lot about the failings of them, and there have been some very major failings, but most of them do it because they want to do the right thing. They think it's useful. They think it's a summary of the science for the world, if you like, for us and for politicians and so on. I don't subscribe to a sort of cynical view that scientists are bad guys out to line their pockets or anything. They have there are political issues around them which they're not fully aware of very often. That's for sure. Probably most of us aren't. I mean, they have a real issue, I think, in IPCC. The IPCC was essentially set up by politicians saying, there's a lot of argument going on about climate change. Will you please go away and agree your story, agree what's going on, and come back and tell us? And that's a really big political context that IPCC works in. They are expected to, and expect themselves to, if you like, come up with as definitive answers as they possibly can. They're not programmed to maximize the uncertainty, even when they see it. And that's a real tension in the organization. So they're programmed to try and come up with simple, understandable answers on which the world from which the world can work. And that's very difficult when you're confronting a lot of uncertainty. So I don't think they're being dishonest. I don't think they are self-serving. But I think it's very well worthwhile us discussing where that process falls down, the kind of pressures that it puts on people, and how they do get themselves into situations where they start making statements which really, as scientists, they ought to feel rather worried about. And that's about as much about us and our expectations of science as it is about the scientists. I mean, we have, as I think I said earlier, unrealistic expectations of what science can do. And scientists sometimes pander to that.
Thank you, Fred. Tony?
Yeah, just a couple of final points. The gentleman asked about truth, and to me, particularly the way you described it, which was a very honest account of your going through this process, it strikes me as a very existential question you're asking, and I think that's the problem with this whole issue. It's being related to an existential level. Like, what is the truth about climate change will tell us something about ourselves, and I don't think it will. I think that it's far more useful to approach it as a technical question in terms of what is the truth about climate change, and there may be some lessons in there. Historically, looking back in 200 years' time, the lessons might be drawn from it. But to treat it as an existential question, I think, is extremely unhelpful. Just on your analogy of the plane 1 in 20 chance, or Chris Rapley was here speaking at the Battle of Ideas a couple of years ago. He said 1 in 100, whatever. I just don't think it works, because if someone says to you, "Do you want to step on this plane? Here's your chances," you know it's a very immediate thing. And what we're dealing with here is a much bigger, much more unfolding thing. It's about it's about society and all the different options that we have. And that unfolds. So you can't, I think the analogy breaks down when you get into the reality of the situation. Because as we learn more, as we have more debates, you can make different decisions. And I think that's the problem, that the science has been used to try and force us into a particular answer. We must act now. We've got to, particularly people like David King and the British scientific establishment have really gone heavy on this. It's like we've got to hit a path of, it used to be 550 parts per million carbon equivalent particles, then it was down to 450. It's like they're really trying to box things into a particular outcome, and I think that's very, very unhelpful for debate and for science. And so finally, just on the IPCC, I think you make a very valid point about, yes, let's be real about lots of things are political. But the IPCC, I think, was established precisely because of the fear of politics. It was the idea that nasty, short-term politicians, greedy individuals, always doing what's in their immediate interest, cannot be trusted with a question of this nature, of this time scale, of this magnitude. So we need the IPCC to deal with it and to do it behind closed doors and then announce the outcome. I think it's time to trust people and trust politics. And yes, politics might not be up to much at the moment, but if we don't trust in ourselves to have these debates and to deal with the uncertainties, then I think we're absolutely stuffed.
Thank you, Tony. Oliver, finally.
Yeah, interesting question about the origins of the IPCC. I mean, the origins of the IPCC come out of an advocacy campaign by a specific scientist, Bert Bolin, who managed to convince people to get some scientists and some politicians to form the institution. And his view was very much the view that in order to get global action, you had to have a scientific body that was accountable to and available to the global south. And that was really the driver for Bolin. I don't dispute your account of, or even say this is necessarily in any way contradictory to your account, but the actual origins of it is a story about north-south inequity. I have some sympathy with the point made back there about worst-caseism, but and it's a very difficult point. It's also an interesting point of asymmetry between people who will happily take worst case analysis on some things and not on others. A good example being Dick Cheney, who was happy to say that a 1% chance of a nation having a nuclear device should be acted on as though we were certain they had a nuclear device, but was not willing to take quite the same level of hardlineness on a 1% chance of climate change. But the question came about what sort of reform, and this goes to your question about why do scientists associate themselves with this? I mean, obviously, as Fred was saying, the main answer is that they do not. Their analysis does not show the IPCC to be the same sort of prostitutional organisation that you make it out to be. They just don't believe that it is that thing, and that is why they associate themselves with it. In the point of reform, I think there's a very strong case. I would broadly go along with the reforms outlined by the Inter-Academics Council. The thing that the IPCC needs most, because it is, as Fred was pointing out, in its bones political. It's not just that it reports to governments. Governments are the process at the end. That process is currently entirely opaque because the plenary sessions are not public events, unlike plenary sessions in UN organisations more typically. I think making plenary sessions and making author choice entirely transparent processes led by defined criteria would be a very big step towards making the IPCC into the thing that I think the vast number of people who contribute to it, as Steve said, for the most part without any form of recompense, believe it to be and want it to be.
Thank you, Oliver. Can we please thank our panel, please?